Denver Broncos head coach Sean Payton says he has 44 roster spots locked in, and that leaves 9 or 10 spots up for grabs as we predict a 53-man roster on today's brand new episode, Locked On Broncos.
You are Locked On Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's happening, Broncos Country? Welcome into another episode, Locked On Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm Cody Roark, Broncos reporter for Mile High Sports, joined as always by Sayre Bedinger, site expert predominantly orange.com. Today's episode, we have a lot to talk about here as we get closer to roster cuts. Denver's got one more preseason game here on tap this week, but who are some players that can lock up roster spots in Sunday's preseason finale? If Sean Payton said that there's 44 spots available, there are 9 or 10 spots potentially open or fluctuating. Which players are competing for some of those spots? And who are Sean Payton's 44 roster locks right now? We'll break all that down on today's episode of the show, which is brought to you by our friends over there at Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Sayre, let's get into the action right here. Also, I want to say thanks to all the everydayers and first listeners out there in Broncos Country. Thanks for following the show. Make sure you subscribe if you haven't done so already. Let's open things up. Sean Payton talking about 44 roster locks, really kind of give or take last week during training camp, kind of giving an idea here and saying, hey, I want to see the evaluation continue for some positions and also some players. We have a lot of names to get through here today, so let's go through. I mean, we could split this up a little bit, but we're going to talk about 44 players we identified that we believe could be Sean Payton's roster locks.
Yeah, the roster locks is the key verbiage there because there's a lot of players that have been impressing this offseason, but doesn't necessarily mean they're roster locks. And there's players that are, veterans that aren't necessarily roster locks. So let's talk through some of these, starting at quarterback. Bo Nix, obvious roster lock. Jarrett Stidham, I think there's a second quarterback roster lock. I think we'll talk more about that as we go along. But Stidham, I think he's really well liked by the team in the locker room. So I think you could consider him a roster lock as well. Javonte Williams, Jaleel McLaughlin, Audric Estime, and Michael Burton. To me, Cody, those guys in the backfield are the locks for those 4 spots. Now, whether the team adds a 5th, we'll talk more about that. But I think those 4 guys in particular feel like roster locks, very well established backfield right now. And then I'll go through the wide receivers, and then I'll let you kind of give your take on these position groups. Courtland Sutton, Tim Patrick, Josh Reynolds, Marvin Mims, Troy Franklin, and Devon Vele. The top 6 receiver positions, if I don't know that the Broncos are going to be able to keep more than that, honestly. But there was some talk about Tim Patrick being on the bubble. I think that's kind of washed away and dissolved into thin air, after what he did in that preseason game against the Packers. And so those 6 wide receiver positions do appear to be locked in. Now, who's going to return kicks? Is it going to be Marvin? We'll talk about more of that. I know we're kind of like to get into those, 9 available positions as you talk about the solidified ones. But what are your thoughts on quarterback, running back, receiver? You think those position groups right there are those guys that we just discussed? Those guys are pretty well set in stone.
Yeah, no, I feel like they are, and we'll get to it. I think maybe that second quarterback could be Jarrett Stidham or Zach Wilson. I mean, you can make your arguments, but I think that they do carry 3 in terms of just roster locks right now. I think Jarrett does bring a lot of value. Michael Burton brings value at the fullback position. Heck, he even got a carry in the preseason game this past week. But I think what we've seen from Javonte, what we've seen from Jaleel, and certainly Audric Estime, especially in pass protection, has been a big standout there. These guys have all shined a little bit more than guys like Samaje Perine. So I agree with you. The top 6 wide receivers, I'm in agreement with you as well about that. Now, I think where it gets interesting is how many tight ends do they keep, right? I think right now it's 3. I think it's Adam Troutman, Greg Dulcich, and Lucas Kroll. And we've left room here because as we're going through these names, like, this is just 44 players here in this first segment that we're going to name that we believe are Payton's roster locks, which means that there are 9 spots available that could be other positions that we've already talked about here. We'll even add that into the wrinkle. Greg Dulcich, Lucas Kroll. Offensive line-wise, I think it's pretty easy right now. If we had to say locks definitively right now, you're starting offensive line. There's 5 guys right there. And I think Alex Forsythe, who's the backup guy to Luke Wattenberg, and also got some run at guard. And look, I know initially when we did our stock up, stock down, we said, okay, hey, I didn't really feel great about Forsythe's performance, mainly because of the penalties. He actually did a lot better than I thought he did going back and rewatching the game on the All-22. So I came away pleasantly surprised about that. So if I had to say, like right now on the offensive line, 6 locks, that doesn't mean that Denver's going to keep 6 offensive linemen. It just means that maybe some of these other spots are up for grabs, which we will get to here in a little bit on the show. And then I think it gets a little interesting too. We go to cornerback. I think we can look at locks right here as Riley Moss, PS2, Damari Mathis, Jaquan McMillan. Those 4 guys will be on this roster regardless as locked-in players. Safety, you got PJ Locke, Brandon Jones, Devin Key, and J.L. Skinner as locks here. There's 4 players. Alex Singleton, Cody Barton, Justin Sternad, Jonas Griffith at inside linebacker as locks. Outside linebacker, the top 4 guys there. We already talked about it. Cooper, Browning, Benito, Jonah Ellis as locks. Defensive line, Zach Allen, JFM, DJ Jones, Malcolm Roach. Those 4 guys as locks. And then probably we're at what, 41? So now we got 3 guys left. Who do you think that's going to be, Sayre? I mean, this is this was a tough exercise to try to piece together 44 guys here.
It was. I mean, the special teamers, though, I mean, you got to keep 3. Every team has to have 3. So Will Lutz, Mitchell Fraboni, and Riley Dixon make a lot of sense. Although Trenton Gill, he kind of boomed that last punt. So, I mean, it makes you kind of wonder there. And I saw him holding on a lot of, kicks as well. So we'll see with punter. But either way, I mean, you have to allocate a roster spot to a punter. So that's one of the 44. The only name that, Cody, I think, you and I checked and double checked this list. I think we got to add a 45th, Chris Abrams-Drain. I don't think he's going anywhere. So one of those spots that we talk about, the 9 coming up, that's going to be taken by Chris Abrams-Drain if you're looking at this. So I think that's one other guy as we go through this list. But like you said, when we're reading through these names, you got to understand that there's a lot of players that I think could make strong cases for the roster. It's not that we're saying the team's only going to keep 4 corners or 6 offensive linemen or, 3 running backs, whatever position group you want to go through. What we're saying here is that Sean Payton talked about having 44 potential roster locks, and we're telling you who we think those guys are, right? I think if that helps explain what we're doing here with this 53-man roster exercise, and we'll go through kind of predicting the rest of this 53. But to me, these guys are the locks. I don't see really anyone on this list, and there could be debate over, some of the guys that we're going to say are among the contenders for roster spots that people will say, man, no, that guy is a lock to make this team. I think, it's beauty in the eye of the beholder when it comes to preseason, training camp, just a perception of a guy from the outside looking in. But I think we may have come pretty close here to nailing this list and maybe even getting it up to 45 guys.
Well, we'll see how it all pans out too the rest of the way, because really with this, that was my bad too. I totally forgot about Chris Abrams-Drain in this list.
I missed him too. That's like I said,
so
we both
45. Yeah, so we got 45 players here. All right, 44, 45. Like, luckily there's no like absolutes in a sense. Like these guys are going to be on the roster in our belief. So now that leaves open 8 potential spots here on the remaining part of this roster going into the regular season. And right now, I think we have a large group of the starters identified. Really no questions beyond that. But who are going to fill out those last 8 spots, whether that's depth on offense and defense, but primarily these are guys I think we believe will play a lot of special teams this upcoming season. If you want to know who we're going to talk about there, Sayre and myself, we're going to give our 8 players potentially we think will be those final locks for the 53-man roster here on today's brand new episode, Locked On Broncos.
Today's show is brought to you by FanDuel, and you've heard us talk a lot about FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Well, we have a little something different for you today. Now, through September 22nd, all FanDuel customers can bet $5 and get a 3-week free trial of NFL Sunday Ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV. Then, with a YouTube TV base plan, you'll be able to watch every regular season Sunday afternoon out-of-market game. This has come through super clutch for me. This is how I watch football every single week, and all you need is a Google account and a current form of payment, and you can cancel every time. So you know what? You got to head over to FanDuel, check out maybe just like a lot of other people in Broncos country right now, smashing the over on that 5.5 win projection for this season. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to download America's #1 sportsbook. If there are 8 to 10 open roster spots for the Denver Broncos going into the final week of the preseason, who's taking those spots? Cody and I have some different players to explore here. Some guys that have connections long-term to Sean Payton, maybe another quarterback. Are you going to keep 3 quarterbacks? We're going to break all that down on today's episode, Locked On Broncos. But want to say thank you to all of you that make Locked On Broncos your first listen of the day every single day. You know, your boys, your friends, Cody and Sayre, we're going to be here for you every single day throughout the preseason, the regular season, the off season. So go ahead, hit subscribe so that you don't miss a single episode of the show, whether it's on your favorite podcast platform, on YouTube, if you haven't already done so, or both. We appreciate you so much for doing that. And for your second listen, check out Locked On Fantasy Football to get all the tips you need to make sure that you got the best roster possible. Cody, I don't know that I'm going to have the best roster in fantasy football, but I think the Broncos are going to have a better roster than people expected. It looks pretty good so far in the preseason. It looks well coached. I know there's been penalties and things like that, but even with the youth on this team, I do feel like there's going to be tough roster cuts, quite frankly, all over the place on this team. And it's not just like a lot of times you get hung up on the sentimental value of a preseason star or a training camp star. And you wonder, like, are the Broncos going to be able to sneak that guy through to the practice squad? I mean, remember even Shaquille Barrett, the Broncos snuck him off on waivers back in 2014 when everybody's like, there's no way that's going to be able to happen. Well, it did happen. And so I think you just never know how that's going to all play out. So in terms of the shock factor of cuts this year, I think we can expect the unexpected. But in terms of guys that are actually going to be the final 8 to 10 players on this roster, who do you start with? Like, who's your first guy that's like, okay, this guy is it. He may not be one of our 44, but to me, he's the guy that deserves the roster spot the most.
Yeah, this is a great little game. I think that you and I can play here in Broncos country, could play along as they're listening or watching here. But let's maybe name some players. Let's maybe talk about, okay, lock or no. I mean, we can kind of fill it out here. I think we got to maybe start at a position that has a lot of numbers here, Sayre. And this is a tough one. Let's start at wide receiver here. There are 3 guys. Obviously, Denver's got in the initial list that we put out, Denver has 6 players at that position. So now it's like, all right, these guys we're talking about, one of these guys being added to that final portion of the roster means that there's 7 wide receivers, which I think is different this year in comparison to the last couple of years, just because of the return aspect and special teams rules that we have seen. And so that prompts us, we identified 3 potential players here: Jalen Virgil, Lil Jordan Humphrey, or Brandon Johnson. If we're looking at any of these players, let's say Denver does carry a 7th wide receiver, who do you think that is? Me personally, I think it's going to be Jalen Virgil, because I think Jalen can contribute as a receiver. Also, he can be a blocker, but also primarily his value as a core 4 special teams guy. And he might be their top return option. We haven't seen Marvin Mims really even touch a return in the preseason, which has been a little interesting considering he's played into these games. So I don't know, Sean Payton trying to hide Marvin Mims a little bit, or is Jalen Virgil maybe working his way into a roster spot, or are these 2 other guys maybe going to make a name for himself? Where do you stand on that? Who are you going with if we have to keep an additional wideout?
Well, I'm with you on Jalen Virgil. I just think, and with all due respect, obviously, to Lil Jordan Humphrey and Brandon Johnson, because those guys are good wide receivers, and they've proven more at wide receiver than at this point than Jalen Virgil has. I know he was injured last year, but they've proven more at that position, and I get that. And there's people that are really, they vouch for those guys quite a bit. I just think you would have an easier time getting one of those 2 guys onto the practice squad compared to Jalen Virgil with the new kickoff format, right? So that's kind of what I'm thinking. And I feel like, okay, let's say Devon Vele and Troy Franklin, let's say those guys are, the 6th and 7th receivers on the depth chart, okay? The 5th receiver on your depth chart could end up being Lil Jordan Humphrey, who is on the practice squad, who gets shuffled up to the active roster. We saw that a number of times last year. So I wouldn't be surprised by that, or I wouldn't be surprised if, I don't know. I don't know what's going to happen, but I'm with you. I think like it's really tough to see how you keep fewer than 7 receivers on this roster and also keep the quality of all those different positions, up. So to me, that is one of those positions. And I think you could say the same thing about cornerback and defensive line, even when we get into guys like, let's start with Tremont Smith, who is maybe the most polarizing guy in Broncos country the last 2 preseasons, because people see Tremont play corner and they're like, man, that guy's not an NFL cornerback. They see him play that position and they're like, why is this guy on the team? And then he ends up being maybe arguably the best special teams player on the roster last year. So Tremont offers value there. He has been returning kicks, and I saw him back for punt as well. So I don't know, Cody, is he one of those guys that's like, all right, next man on the 53, you got to find room for a guy like Tremont Smith?
Yeah, that's tough. I mean, if we're adding, let's say, Jalen to the thing, there's 46 players, right? For me, Tremont, this is the year where he doesn't come back in a sense, because look at all the young guys that Denver has gotten. I was watching Chris Abrams-Drain, a guy who they drafted at cornerback. I watched him play all of his special teams reps. I was blown away. I mean, he's a fantastic jammer. He's going to be, I think he can be a very good gunner. I think Devon Vele, he didn't see him in this last game here. He'll be a gunner. Jalen Virgil will be a gunner in a sense. So, I think you can replace Tremont Smith in a situation like this with some of your young guys. So when I look at him, not necessarily going with Tremont, but now we go to another position, another DB, has had a really good preseason. Keidron Smith. Is he a lock, or is it maybe a bubble? Like, these are all guys I feel like are potentially on the bubble in terms of that. But in terms of positions of need right now, I look at safety. Denver, we already identified 4 guys. Is that okay? I feel like right now it is. But what about offensive tackle? Because there are 2 guys that we feel like could be good depth options. When you do have a swing guy in Forsyth who can play center and guard for you, well, now you have 2 tackles who were undrafted last year in Demontre Jacobs and Alex Palczewski. Part of me feels like these 2 guys right here are locks, which would bring it to 48 players.
Yeah, I could definitely see that, because I mean, Demontre has played well at left tackle. Palczewski has played both right tackle and the guard position in the preseason as well, and we know the coaching staff likes him a lot and his experience. The offensive line is really tough for me, Cody, because then you get into guys like Calvin Throckmorton was the first guy up after Ben Powers, who didn't play against Green Bay. So is Throckmorton, with his experience and versatility, like, do you throw him into this mix as well? This is where the 53-man roster becomes super, super complicated even from our vantage point. Like, we study the roster. We look at every single one of these players. If you've ever played Sudoku, like those puzzles, it's almost impossible to kind of try to figure these things out. Like, how do you make it work? So I think for me, the non-negotiable out of that group has got to be Palczewski because of the versatility. And then you factor in Matt Peart as well. I don't know where the Broncos are at with him. I don't think he's looked that good in the preseason. Then you got Pro Football Focus out here saying that he's looking like an all-pro basically with their grades. So I don't
actually watch the games.
Right. That's what I'm saying. I'm like, he's giving up a lot of pressure out there to me. So I don't know, but we'll see what the Broncos feel about that. The offensive line is one of those that, like, historically speaking, Payton has kept 8 and not often more than 9. And there's probably 9 or 10 guys on this roster that will play on NFL teams this year. So that's another tough area. Defensive line as well, with Angelo Blackson, Yoma Uwazurike. We only mentioned 4 guys in our roster locks. You're going to see the Broncos keep at least 5 defensive linemen. And I think if I had to pick between those 2, it would be Uwazurike.
Yeah, no, and I think it's because of the investment there. I struggle with the thought, because it's like, okay, yes, you drafted him, and yes, you could have cut ties with him, but he hasn't played in over a year. He got his first NFL game action this past week. Is it enough, or was it enough in a sense to impress the coaching staff? And if it wasn't just yet, is he at a point, because he hasn't played in a year because of the suspension, where if the Broncos release him, they can just bring him back? I don't know what the right move is here. Like, this is where it gets a little tricky when you look at the overall numbers of guys there. I think Jordan Jackson has looked better. Granted, he's played more and he's had more experience right now than Uwazurike. So it's kind of a huge question mark here. And we get into other guys too. I mean, Sayre, tight end, fullback, hybrid guy, Nate Adkins is playing special teams too. Does Denver keep 4 tight ends with Adkins? Like, this is where I think it gets a little challenging. And you look at other things too, like running backs. Like we have them keeping 3 in terms of roster locks. Do they keep a 4th? And if so, who would that be? If it's between Tyler Beatty or Samaje Perine, I would go with Tyler Beatty at this point. Tyler Beatty has shown a little bit more. What about quarterbacks? Do they keep 2 or do they maybe keep 3, which means that, hey, Zach Wilson, Jarrett Stidham stay on the roster behind a guy like Bo Nix? I don't know how this is going to go, but I imagine for Sean Payton, for George Payton and this staff, they've been sitting around saying, okay, hey, two preseason games. Maybe that list jumps from 44 to maybe they have 47 or 48 roster locks. And now those final couple of spots are maybe in flux at this point. I don't know how it's going to go, but I definitely feel the dilemma. Like, I feel like if I'm the general manager and like you and I are doing this exercise right now, this has been very, very tough to do.
Yeah, and you're going to need all the voices to help, like George Payton and David Shaw and Kelly Klein and Darren Muji. All those guys and gals in the front office are going to have a very difficult task here. And then you get the coaches' voices in the mix. You get coordinators in the mix, and they vouch for their guys. And so it is going to be tough, Cody. And I think with Zach Wilson too, and maybe we can bring him up more in the next segment, some interesting comments from Sean Payton recently regarding Zach Wilson, who he previously noted as the most unfairly hated quarterback in the NFL, according to his own opinion. So there's a lot of different things at play, a lot of different factors. And of course, you want to carry the right 53. Sean Payton has said that. It's all about finding at training camp who's the right 53. And it's not just about beating Seattle, even though it is, right? I mean, you have to beat Seattle. You want to beat Seattle, but you also have to factor in your roster is going to be something that's spread out over the next, X amount of years. It's not just, all right, who's going to be our top 53 for Seattle or who's going to be our 46 for Seattle. You have to consider the future when you have such a young roster like this. So that could lead to some really interesting sacrifices in the near future.
Well, Broncos country, it is a little bit of a tough task to project a 53-man roster. We have our ideas to what it's going to be, but more importantly, we can maybe get more clarity by defining who are some players who can lock up some roster spots here this weekend. If there's 45 spots right now with 8 spots left to go, who are some players who have the best opportunity to go out in week 3 of the preseason to finalize that? We'll tell you why here on today's episode, Locked On Broncos.
Today's episode, Locked On Broncos, is brought to you by Game Time. And if you're a sports fan, I'm guessing you love going to live events, no matter if it might be a sports game, it might be a concert, it might be, something like that. But we love making memories at these events because, well, we get to spend time with the people that we love, watching the teams that we love, or watching our favorite musicians, right? And if you're looking forward to making new memories this year, you need to check out Game Time. Game Time has a brand new feature called Game Time Picks that makes getting tickets for your favorite live events even easier. Game Time Picks filters out the fluff to show you only incredible deals on great seats, and you don't have to waste any time searching through thousands of tickets. There's even a cool offer if you're going to be around the area, 50% off Labor Day for Diamondbacks Dodgers. May want to check that out if you're in the area. But you go onto the Game Time app, you pick an upcoming live event, and you just browse through your seats. And that's my favorite feature of Game Time, is that you can customize and look at the spot that you want to sit in before you even get there. A seat view before you buy, always a lowest price guarantee, event cancellation protection, job loss protection. It's all there with Game Time. So take the guesswork out of buying concert tickets or event tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem the code LOCKEDONNFL, LOCKEDON NFL for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed.
As we jump in the fourth quarter action on today's episode, Locked On Broncos, we'll maybe talk about who are some players who can go out there this weekend against the Arizona Cardinals, 2:30 p.m. Mountain Time on Sunday, and can lock up a roster spot on the 53. You're going to get that here on today's show. Thanks to all the everydayers and first listeners out there in Broncos country for tuning in. We appreciate you so much. I want to welcome in anybody who's a brand new first-time listener of the show, and just want to say thank you so much for checking us out. If you love the conversation here, you get it like this every single day, so subscribe or follow so you never miss out on what's going on. Sayre, I look at this weekend's game against the Arizona Cardinals, and look, obviously, we anticipate probably most of the starters will not play in this game. Who knows? Sean Payton say, you know what, go out and get a series. Certainly a possibility. Maybe he wants to see the band play a little bit more here on this game. Can we get an encore? But who are we going to identify as some players, in your opinion, that if they can go out based on the preseason that they have had, they can go out there and maybe secure a 53-man roster spot? What would that look like? What would these guys that we're going to talk about need to show in order to do just that?
Well, maybe let's just continue the conversation real quick with Zach Wilson here. I think Zach is somebody that Sean Payton really likes and has vouched for publicly a number of times now. If you haven't seen the interview between Sean Payton and Diana Rossini, Chase Daniel, I think it's worth going and watching and listening to some of the stuff he says. You might get some nuggets for your 53-man roster projection based on the things that he says there. But I think he really does like Zach Wilson a lot. And I kind of feel like his spot on the team, if it's not already solidified, I think a good game against Arizona, in which we assume Zach is going to play a lot, I think that could solidify his roster spot there as well. I know we've kind of talked about that throughout the offseason. Are they keeping 2 quarterbacks? Are they going to keep 3? If you keep 3, you have to make a sacrifice somewhere else. So it is a tough call. What are your thoughts on that? Do you think Zach has solidified a spot, or do you think he can solidify a spot here against Arizona?
I think he can solidify a spot here against Arizona, and maybe it is on the premise of being the number 2 quarterback here for Denver. I mean, I think there's going to be teams that are probably monitoring, the situation. I think Green Bay's backup quarterback situation, it's kind of rough in a sense, because Zach Wilson maybe end up in Green Bay behind Jordan Love. Could Jarrett Stidham maybe end up in Green Bay behind Jordan Love, considering where they were at in this past week? There are other teams around the league, obviously, that you have to monitor. But the thing that Zach Wilson, in terms of the conversation about him with Diana Rossini, Chase Daniel, Sean Payton said, like, hey, this kid has turned it on the last 2.5 weeks here. And he said, I went up to Zach and I said, hey, I don't want you to think. I just want you to go out there and play. My job here is to make you millions, whether that's with us or whether that's with somebody else. He didn't get I don't feel like he had an opportunity to come in warm in week 2 against the Green Bay Packers. As bad as the Packers were playing, the Broncos' third-team offensive line, granted, even the second-team offensive line didn't do Jarrett Stidham or Zach Wilson any favor. So it was hard for Zach to get into rhythm. But you know what? I think he's carried himself the way that you should the entire offseason. I mean, Zach has been a great locker room guy. He's been a great guy in that quarterback room there. He's helped because he's got the most experience at everybody in that room when we talk about NFL experience. So that can't be discounted. I think he can solidify a spot for him on the roster this week. We do anticipate he will play quite a bit. Now I'm going to ask you about a player here I think we will see a lot. I think we'll see him play a lot. I think Troy Franklin will play a lot, but obviously we talked about him as a roster lock. But the guy we kind of talked about maybe as that 7th wide receiver, if Denver factors into the return game here, Jalen Virgil, in your opinion, is there anything that he can do or should do this weekend, whether that's in the return game or the receiving game, that in your opinion can lock him up maybe one of those final roster spots?
I mean, if he has another 40-yard return, Cody, what do you do with that? Because he had one against the Indianapolis Colts, and if he has another 40-yard, I don't know how many kickoff returners around the league this preseason, would have to do some research on that, have had multiple 40-plus yard returns. But I think if Jalen has another one, like, how do you ignore that possibility? The possibility of a game-changing return at any point during the game, that would consider him, to me, to be a roster lock. I don't know how you could keep him off your team, because yes, you have Marvin Mims, and I think that's awesome, but you need to have 2 returners right now. That's what, in terms of the new rules and things like that, teams, if they hit the ball in the landing zone and it goes into the end zone, you as the returning team get basically penalized for that. You don't want the ball to get hit in the landing zone and bounce into the end zone. You need to have 2 guys back there that could offer you that dynamic return presence at any point. If you have Marvin Mims and Jalen Virgil back there, who's going to be able to stop you from winning the field position battle almost every game? At worst case scenario, you start at the 30 to 35, you're able to punt it deep into enemy territory from there. You're not starting 10 yards deeper. And so I just think with Jalen, if he has another explosive return, I don't even know that he has to do anything offensively to prove, because he might be one of the Broncos' best receivers in terms of after the catch abilities. They don't have many of those guys. So I think he doesn't have to do much there. He's already one of the fastest guys on the team. If he has another explosive return, to me, I don't see how you can cut him.
No, I mean, it's going to be very, very hard to do that. And look, I agree. Like, the Broncos want to be great in the return department. They have goals to be the number one return team in the National Football League. And look, Marvin, we know Marvin's ability is very, very fun to watch. He's fast, he's elusive, and you combine him with Jalen Virgil, who, like, I don't know if people have noticed, Jalen Virgil is big. He's bulkier, he's stronger, and he's still just as quick, from his time at Appalachian State. So very excited to maybe see how this one goes out. I feel like Dondrea Tillman and Thomas Incoom are in a very, very interesting battle right now, I think, for maybe that fifth outside linebacker spot. In your opinion, if you had to look between these two guys, who do you feel like maybe has the advantage? Because I feel like Tillman could, because I saw him already make some plays this past week on special teams, some good pressure here in this preseason game, even though Incoom has had a really good preseason and really good training camp as well. This is a tough one.
Yeah, I think Tillman has stood out more to me in the preseason games. I know that his name didn't pop up as much in training camp as Thomas Incoom, but to me, Tillman has stood out more in the preseason games with his ability to play on the edge, run defense, pass rush, had the strip sack against the Colts, has also been making plays on special teams. So to me, Tillman would be that guy who would win that last, if it's a fifth spot that they have available, because we know the Broncos are really good off the edge right now. Baron Browning, Jonathan Cooper, Nick Bonito, Jonah Ellis, those guys are all going to play and be active on game days. So a fifth guy, it's going to come down to special teams and especially on the kickoff coverage. So I think Tillman has a chance to win that spot. And I think he has stood out to me just a little bit more.
Yeah, and look, this is, like you mentioned earlier, I think that the phrasing of it is beauty's in the eye of the beholder. I think you and I are in agreement in terms of what we are seeing here. And then maybe at this point, another guy we talked about, we mentioned Angelo Blackson, Jordan Jackson. I think these guys can come out there. I mean, Angelo Blackson's been a veteran. I mean, if he doesn't come out and play in this game, I think more than likely it says, hey, he's locked up a roster spot. So I think that'll be something for us to follow here this week. And look, Broncos Country, we're always eager for your thoughts. If you want to send us your 53-man roster projections, you can always do that. You can post it on YouTube. You can DM us on social media, wherever you're at. We'll be happy to read it and react and share our thoughts as to that. So with that said, for all you everydayers out there, tomorrow's episode, Locked On Broncos, here's what you can expect. The Broncos are back on the practice field on Wednesday. We'll go through some of the biggest storylines, and we are on Bo Nix, starter to be named, watch alert. So whenever that happens, you get a breaking news episode breaking down what this means, what are some expectations, and how this can impact the Broncos here this upcoming season. You can expect that and much more on Locked On Broncos. We'll see you tomorrow.